Hounded by a legion of fearsome monsters, a group of heroes happens upon a fortified church to hide out in. Once inside, an old blind man offers them refuge in exchange for a small service. He simply asks that the heroes go and kill sin itself. They will not be permitted to leave until they have vanquished all 7 Sin Lords, each representing one of the deadly sins. So let's go ahead and slap a couple of big ol' f***ing quotation marks around the word small service. Welcome to Random Game Reviews. I created a spreadsheet containing every game in the PlayStation Store and use a random number generator to determine which game I will play and review. This time, the RNG demands Sin Slayers. In Sin Slayers, you control a team filled with unforgettable characters such as Protector, Warrior, Huntress, and etc. Each character has a distinct set of abilities for you to mix and match as you progress through this classic RPG/dungeon crawler. This game is very simple. First, you put your team together, then you launch them into one of the game's exciting locales, such as the Forest of Gluttony, the Village of Envy, or the Ruins of Lust, because as we all know, there's nothing hornier than a bunch of crumbly buildings. Once there, you sorta boop around this isometric dungeon map, looting and fighting until you find your way to the boss. The fights themselves are very straightforward. You square up against some monsters and everybody takes turns wailing on each other or buffing themselves. If you want to use your character's more powerful abilities, you have to build up your rage. Rage points are a bit like mana, and I love this system because it suggests that your heroes have to get good and pissed off before they can really let loose. You get 1 rage point per turn, so the longer the fight goes on, the angrier they get. To help things along, you can drink a potion or eat an infuriating roast turkey. Have you ever gotten so mad that you could just shoot 3 arrows at the same time about it? Each area has its own sets of monsters with different abilities and weaknesses, so it's beneficial to change your team up depending on where you're going. There's an okay variety of enemies, but Sin Slayers is super grindy, so I got sick of seeing most of them before long. Some are definitely more obnoxious to deal with than others, but there's not a whole lot of gameplay variety throughout. That said, I found Sin Slayers to be a fairly chill throwback to retro RPGs. This is a pretty streamlined game where you don't have to think that hard about what abilities to use, so I found it was an easy game to relax to. Sometimes it's just nice to bash some monsters in exchange for experience, gold, and items. Though I'm wary of all the fresh meat and produce I'm getting from these cemetery ghosts. Is there some farmer's market they're all on their way back from? When exploring dungeons, you'll deal with traps that deal damage to your team if you don't have any disarming kits handy, and you'll be confronted with special events which mostly involve looting graves and corpses. If you choose to defile the resting places of the dead, your indiscretion will be rewarded with gold and gear, or punished with a fight, which is really just a more roundabout way to get gold and gear. But what will also happen is that your sin level will increase, which is tracked up here by the Sinometer. The higher it climbs, the more difficult the enemies will get because it seems they get really fired up about grave robbing. Choosing to not rob graves will result in a reduction to your sin level, because that's apparently how morality works. I'm sure the argument, but what about all the graves I didn't rob, would definitely hold up in court. The top-down Fog of War dungeon crawling mechanic works, and feels novel, especially when you're deep into a run and low on health, but I feel like they could do less when it comes to the sheer volume of events, traps, and fights. Sin Slayers has a crafting mechanic which you can use to make potions, weapons, and armor, but the boss fights give you pretty hot gear, so I never found I was making anything better than I was getting for just playing the game. Leveling doesn't matter that much because you get pretty minor stat buffs, which is nice because it allows you to freely switch up your team. And Sin Slayers looks pretty good in a retro Sega Genesis sort of way. I especially like the fight backdrops. Very pretty. But don't get me wrong, Sin Slayers has sins of its own. Overall, it lacks basic polish. The menus are clunky and really annoying to navigate. The button mapping isn't intuitive. It can be hard to tell which target is highlighted for an ability or attack. There's no indication as to what any of the stats do, and the writing is comically bad. The developer advertises Sin Slayers as having rogue-like elements, so I tested to see what happens when your party gets wiped out, which is nothing. You just bounce back to the church and carry on like nothing happened. I think the only possible thing they could be referencing is that the dungeons are randomly generated so that they're different every time you enter. I know that roguelike is basically just a buzzword at this point, but I'm still calling false advertising. It takes a stupidly long time to load each battle. How long, you ask? This long. With how many fights there are in any given dungeon, this amounts to a lot of wasted time. And this is super specific, but it really got my rage points up. In order to recruit the Inquisitor, he asks that you craft him an Inquisitor mace and Inquisitor armor in exchange for joining you. And when I did, and he joined me, he didn't have either of those items equipped. He just stands there like, what mace? Motherfucker, I used my only battle axe to make that. Additionally, there's this weird thing that happens where the game is almost too easy until you get to the Cave of Greed, which is the 4th area of 7. The Cave of Greed is a tough area in general and was the first spot where I felt like the dungeon crawl became a real grind. And because the Sin Lord Greed is a couple orders of magnitude more difficult than the preceding bosses and would annihilate me with the mimics he kept summoning, I spent almost as much time in this area as the rest of the areas in the game combined. I put somewhere between 10 and 12 hours into this game, and by the time I beat Greed, I couldn't keep going with it. Greed sucked up all my desire to play. And I'm not alone. Of everyone who played this game, only around 15% beat Greed to get to Act 3, and only half those players continued on past that. And speaking of Greed, this game's a bit overpriced for what you get at $27 Canadian, when a game like Dead Cells only costs about $7 more. With all that said, I didn't hate this game. It's not a sin to fall short, but I do wish the developers were a bit more intentional with their use of sin as a theme. Why is envy a jester? Nobody wants to be a jester. And why is gluttony in a forest? You have to work for your food in a forest. Outside is where exercise is. Sloth being in a cemetery makes sense though. Dead bodies are notoriously sedentary. It's time to answer the question, would I play this game if I were not destined to do so? For Sin Slayers, the answer is maybe? I actually liked this game for about 7 or 8 hours. Then it really started to wear on me. Maybe it's something I could pick up again later. Sin Slayers has a lot of problems, from long load times to sloppy menu design to an insane difficulty curve with a busted boss fight. And it's a bit overpriced and never seems to go on sale. I think if this game were a bit cheaper, it would push me towards a yes. But issues aside, this is a decent throwback RPG that might scratch a nostalgia itch for anyone who grew up with a Sega Genesis. That does it for this episode. Have you ever found yourself thinking, gee, I wish Random Game Reviews would review insert game title here? Well, now's your chance to put your thumb on the scales of fate. Tell me in the comments what game you want to see me review for episode 30, and I will draw randomly from that list 1 week after the release of this video. Hit me with either your best or dumbest suggestion, and I'll see you all soon on Random Game Reviews. P.S. I love the uneven voice acting by the narrator. Please enjoy.
Our heroes saw that their only salvation lay behind the church's high walls. As they have expected, there were other people sheltering behind those walls as well.